What's up in space? It's more than just Starlink. We've got the latest on all the various contenders looking to bring satellite broadband down to Earth. Hi, I'm Chris with the Mobile Internet Resource Center, here to give you an update on satellite internet options, particularly focused on the angle of us technomadic travelers who want to get connected on the road, on the water, or wherever we happen to be. Now, it's been a pretty exciting year when it comes to satellite internet, and most of that excitement has been revolving around SpaceX's Starlink. A lot has been happening with SpaceX. They've been pushing Starlink to more and more territories. They've been expanding service. They're up to 250,000 customers around the world. And most exciting for us nomads is just in this past month, they've been turning on, still unofficially, a service portability mode, which will let you take a Starlink and roam and connect away from your home address in a much more flexible fashion than has ever been possible before. So that is the good, exciting news in the SpaceX Starlink front. You can finally start to sort of take this with you. But not all is good news in the Starlink world. Just this week, SpaceX sent out a surprise price increase, raising the cost of Dishy to buy new from $499 to $599, and increasing the monthly service price from $99 a month to $110 a month. And perhaps most disturbingly, SpaceX, in doing this, has demonstrated that they are not going to be grandfathering in early adopters with their initial pricing. Everybody is getting this price increase, unlike a lot of cellular carriers where you get a plan, you can keep it as long as you want, and the price stays the same. SpaceX is showing that, well, that's not necessarily true with them, and maybe there will be other term changes and pricing changes in the future. So we have to keep that in mind as we watch Starlink continue to expand and dealing with more and more demand and potential for congestion. So what is up with the future of SpaceX and Starlink, and what is the state of their constellation rolling out? When we did a big update last summer, we were celebrating SpaceX had just completed its first orbital shell of roughly 1,500 satellites. And one orbital shell is, basically fully populated. It means the SpaceX has continuous 24/7 coverage on the Earth underneath the orbits of those satellites. And that initial shell provided coverage between 57 degrees north latitude and 57 degrees south latitude. So SpaceX kind of has global coverage over at least most of the populated world. In the year since, they've been now starting to fill in their second shell, and it's been interesting to see they did a few launches to polar orbit to start to do truly global coverage, covering the poles and everything else, but they've actually now seemingly backburnered the polar launches and are now focusing on another capacity layer shell at covering roughly the same latitudes. And they're about 30% through filling and fleshing out that next shell. The big difference between the first shell and the second, however, is that the second shell, all the Starlink satellites in the shell are equipped with space lasers. Now, what this means is that the satellites can talk to each other in space to relay your data from one satellite to the next, and then down to Earth, which means you no longer are dependent on ground stations. Now, that doesn't really make a big deal in North America in particular. There are plenty of Starlink ground stations that the whole country is able to be covered here. But for international cruisers or people traveling afar and stuff, having satellite laser interlinks, once that shell is fully complete and has full coverage, will mean SpaceX will be able to cover people out to sea or in countries where there's no ground stations or anywhere else, assuming they have the local licensing rights. Now, going ahead, this is SpaceX's still has a lot of development to do to get that next shell up, get the lasers going and stuff, but that'll probably be completed sometime later in 2022, which will be a major increase in both capacity, and the laser connects will give it more coverage in a broader area. But what's next for Starlink after that is even more ambitious. SpaceX is planning to launch a lot of Starlink satellites, thousands of them. They've actually applied with the FCC for licenses to have a next generation constellation of 30,000 Starlink satellites. And these next generation satellites are going to be bigger, more powerful, much more capable than the first generation that is up there now. So that's going to be kind of key to Starlink's future success as a business. And, well, those new satellites are going to need a new ride to space. And that's kind of where SpaceX is betting their entire company on their upcoming Starship launcher and Super Heavy booster. So this is a rocket that has not flown yet. Might have its first test flight sometime this summer. But once it is fully operational, the Starship will be able to launch hundreds of Starlink satellites at a time, come back and land right on the pad it took off from, refuel, and basically just go again. And Elon Musk is saying that the future of Starlink is dependent on getting Starship to a pace of being able to launch every 2 weeks. He said he wants to be at that pace by the end of 2022, which is incredibly ambitious of a schedule. But, well, we'll see if he can pull it off. That's kind of what SpaceX is betting their future on. So we've got a lot to track, a lot to see, and it's going to be really interesting to see how Starlink continues to develop and how the terms and the plans and the offerings and what actual consumers are able to get changes over time as well. Now, talking about SpaceX and mobility and portability, there's kind of like two ways it seems that SpaceX is going to be pursuing taking Starlink on the road. The first is seemingly on the verge of launching, and that is portable service or portability, where you can take your Dishy away from your registered home address and it will roam in other locations. And that seems to be turned on in most places in the United States right now for most accounts, although it has still not officially been launched by Starlink. But the Starlink Terms of Services has been updated to explain that portability will work on a best effort fashion, and that when you're traveling and roaming in portable mode, you will be basically subject to network management, network capacity limits, and you'll be at a lower priority on the network than people who are at their home address. So that's how portability will work, and it'll remain to be seen just how network congestion might impact people taking Starlink to areas where performance might not be acceptable in portable fashions. Now, what about actually using Starlink in motion? Well, the current generation of Starlink Dishy was not designed for mobility, not designed to be used in motion on a boat or an RV or a vehicle of any sort. And we do know that Starlink is working on a version of Dishy that is designed for mobility. They've filed for licenses with the FCC last summer, talking about a future mobile version that would require professional installation. The specific details of that are still completely unknown. They have not been released, but it will very likely be completely different hardware, potentially quite a bit more expensive, and maybe even a completely different service plan, potentially quite a bit more expensive for true in-motion usage. Now, some people have been experimenting with the current Dishy using it in motion, and it is just as the last few weeks working sometimes for some people, but it is still considered very unofficial, very experimental, and SpaceX is very clear it avoids your warranty. Now, even though it might seem like it, because of all the Starlink news, SpaceX isn't the only company attempting to bring a next-generation satellite constellation into orbit to service the world. The two kind of names that get mentioned the most in contrast to SpaceX is OneWeb and Amazon's Project Kuiper. So both of these are actually up to some interesting stuff. OneWeb, it is mostly bad news. So OneWeb seems, for a while, looked like they were actually going to beat SpaceX towards having next-generation satellite service, signing up real customers. They were moving ahead on a regular launch cadence, going well, getting a lot of satellites up there. And then the pandemic hit, and, well, that kind of derailed OneWeb. They went bankrupt until the British government stepped in, refunded OneWeb, got them back to launching. They're back on track, launching every month. They were 2/3 of the way through building out their constellation and being ready to start turning on service across the globe. And, well, Russia invaded Ukraine, and OneWeb, this entire model is built on contracting for Soyuz launches to put all their satellites into orbit, and their launches, their next batch of satellites was literally left stranded on the pad and abandoned. And Russia canceled all of their contracts with OneWeb and has left OneWeb scrambling with no way to get the rest of their satellites into orbit. And, well, with still 220 satellites to go before they have global coverage, it's kind of hard for OneWeb to continue with their plans to bring out service later this year. It's kind of very unfortunate for OneWeb, but well, they've actually been driven into their arms of their competitor SpaceX, because in addition to doing Starlink, SpaceX is basically the only launch provider who's got spare rockets that OneWeb can contract with. So it's going to be another big 6-month delay, even longer for OneWeb, as they re-engineer to launch on a SpaceX Falcon 9 instead of a Russian Soyuz. But OneWeb will be hopefully getting back on track later in 2022, and now maybe their service will start to show up in 2023. But one other important thing about OneWeb is it seems like they've given up on focusing on consumers. They're focusing on the enterprise market, the government market, and on big partners. And the big partner in particular that might actually bring OneWeb service to consumers is HughesNet, which has actually said that they're working with OneWeb down the road to, maybe still 2 or 3 years away, to have kind of a combination service that will use OneWeb's low Earth orbit satellite network and HughesNet's geostationary legacy satellite network. So not a lot to serve nomads anytime soon, but in 2 or 3 years, there's a lot of great technology that OneWeb's deploying, and could be interesting then. But again, poor companies, so many roadblocks they've run into, and we'll just have to see what might hit them next. The next big satellite constellation of note is one that has not even launched a single prototype yet, and that is Amazon's Project Kuiper. Now, normally, wouldn't even pay much attention to a satellite network that hasn't even begun to get off the ground, but this is Amazon we're talking about, with nearly infinite money and resources to throw at this, and they have said that they are all in, spending tens of billions of dollars to become a Starlink competitor, and well, Amazon's got the money to potentially do it. There has not been a lot of updates on Project Kuiper in a long while. Amazon is doing most of their development behind closed doors, but they have their necessary FCC licenses. They have actually announced that towards the end of 2022, they'll be launching their first 2 prototype satellites to prove out and test their architecture, and they have bought satellite launch capacity in 2023 and beyond to start actually launching commercial service. So we'll hopefully find out a lot more about Project Kuiper later in 2022, and maybe we'll actually start to see launches in 2023, but it's still going to be a long ways away before Kuiper is ready to start serving people. But we do know Amazon is targeting consumers. They're targeting to bring out a very affordable service, and it'll be really interesting to see if they have any provisions for mobility, or if they'll just be focusing on fixed locations. But you cannot not pay attention to Amazon just because they are so big, so massive, so powerful, and seemingly putting a lot of money into being a next generation satellite service provider. All the constellations we've talked about so far are low Earth orbit systems that are orbiting in the 500-mile range above Earth. The traditional satellite communication satellites are in geostationary orbit, 26,000 miles over the equator, way up high, but because they're so high, they basically appear to be staying at a fixed location in the sky. They stay over the exact point on the ground, so dishes can aim at them and basically lock into the service of those geostationary satellites. The upside of these geostationary satellites is these can be very, very large, very, very powerful satellites that can provide a ton of capacity focused on a very particular area, because they can be designed to aim for just a single country or just a single area of the planet. The downside of geostationary satellites is, well, the speed of light. They're so far away that there is an inevitable delay as communication goes back and forth to those satellites. Low Earth orbit satellites, on the other hand, are so much closer to the Earth that they only cover a small area that they're passing over. So it takes hundreds or thousands of satellites to cover the Earth. And that also means that most of the time, most of those low Earth orbit satellites are basically wasted because they're passing over water. We are on a water planet, or other uninhabited areas. We consider that the continental United States is less than 2% of the Earth's surface. A lot of the satellites launched, low Earth orbit satellites launched servicing North America, are really just kind of twiddling their thumbs for most of the time they're spending in orbit. So geostationary satellites do have a certain technical advantage. They can service focus all their capacity on a single area. But they've got the latency thing that they can deal with. Can legacy satellite providers find a way to compete in this new world with low Earth orbit competitors? And the two legacy satellite providers who focused on consumers in the past both do have plans to go forward. First up is Viasat, and they are preparing to launch later in 2022 a constellation they're calling Viasat 3. It will consist of 3 satellites spread out around the globe in fixed locations that will be the largest, by far, highest capacity satellites ever put into orbit. So massive amounts of bandwidth and capacity, but at a huge, huge distance away. But Viasat has also then now bought Inmarsat, which is a company that is focused on satellites servicing the marine market. And Inmarsat is working on a low Earth orbit satellite constellation called Orchestra that will have 198 satellites lower down. So at some point, they might be able to combine the high capacity of the geostationary satellites with the lower latencies of the low Earth orbit satellites and bring out some interesting service. We will have to see what Viasat does once Viasat 3 launches. The Orchestra constellation isn't even scheduled for launch yet, but they're certainly investing, and particularly for the marine market, we're going to be really curious to see what Inmarsat brings out, because that is their bread and butter. They really know the marine market. The other legacy satellite provider of note is HughesNet, or Hughes. They also have a new satellite launching in 2022, the Jupiter 3, another geostationary satellite with a ton of capacity. And they've just announced recently that they have a technology called multi-transport satellite LTE capability that will let the Hughes geostationary satellites pair with cellular on the ground. So you get the low latency of cellular and the high capacity of their future Jupiter 3 to kind of let them compete with a more Starlink-like service. They're saying they're able to deliver latency as low as 40 milliseconds to make what they call a noticeably snappier web browsing experience. It makes satellite feel a lot more like terrestrial internet. But the catch with that sort of technology is it requires being in areas where they've got LTE partners that they can actually do the cellular connection. It kind of gets rid of one of the huge advantages of satellite, is that it works places there's no cellular. But it's interesting to see how Hughes is trying to compete after being so steamrolled by the new generation of satellites. And going forward, actually, Hughes is an investor and partner with OneWeb. So as we mentioned before, in the years ahead, Hughes, with their high-capacity satellites, might be doing a combination with OneWeb and their LEO satellites and low latency service. So interesting stuff, but again, nothing too exciting in the next year or two ahead. So that was a look at the kind of the state of the bigger players when it comes to satellite internet options that are coming down the road. There's a few other ones that are more flights of fancy that we're tracking that might get interesting in the years ahead. Two interesting ones in particular are AST SpaceMobile and Lynk. These two companies claim to have developed technology that will allow an everyday, normal, unmodified LTE cell phone to communicate directly with their satellites. That means you have cell phone coverage everywhere, no more dead zones. Sounds kind of amazing if it can actually work. And they are in the process of this year launching prototype satellites to make further demonstrations of what their technology can do. It seems like at first, mostly it'll be focused on things like text messaging and voice calls, but eventually they claim that their capabilities will scale to being able to do broadband service. Now, AST SpaceMobile has shown off that the prototype they're planning to launch is going to have a satellite that deploys such a gigantic unfurlable antenna in space that they say they might be able to do service even indoors. An antenna strong enough to penetrate roofs and into buildings. So that'd be pretty amazing to get that from space. And well, Lynk, they're focusing primarily on text messaging at first, and they actually might be the first to commercial service. They have a partnership with Alive in the Bahamas to roll out satellite-powered text messaging potentially in 2022. So some interesting technology from these two providers that we'll see if it actually pans out. They're still in the very early stage of just proving their worth and signing up investors. We actually are tracking a few other interesting constellations in the works. Some of them are audacious. There's actually one that's planning to have a constellation of 100,000 satellites from a company called eSpace. So if you are kind of curious of some of these pie in the sky things, go check the article that goes along with this video, and we share some of the known details of these other things that are coming down the pipe. Now, wrapping it up, there's, tracking the space industry is pretty exciting. Usually things move pretty slowly, but well, there's a lot of things happening quickly now thanks to SpaceX and Starlink, and there's a lot of other new things that are, balls that are getting rolling, or satellites that are getting orbiting, happening starting in 2022. So this is going to be an interesting year ahead to see what comes, what launches, what technologies prove themselves. But for the time being, for nomads who are wanting to get connected from space, it really is a SpaceX Starlink game. They are so far ahead at the moment as far as practical service that you can buy today that they're really the only game in town for the way a lot of nomads want to get connected. And to that end, we've actually just published a very in-depth guide to using Starlink for mobility and nomads and staying connected on the go. We have just published that on our site. It includes tips on how to get Starlink service immediately without waiting in line for your area to get selected and your deposit to be processed and such, and tips for practical use and everything else. And we'll be keeping that guide up to date because that stuff is changing so frequently. So do check out that guide and connect and follow along there. And then, well, just going ahead, what is the future? Is connectivity going to become all space-based, or what about cellular and 5G? Is it one or the other? And our advice, our best guess at the future is no, it's not a one or the other game. Satellite and cellular will become very complementary technologies. The ideal connectivity solutions will involve having both of them. And well, even Elon Musk acknowledges that Starlink is not meant to be a competitor to cellular. It is designed to complement and work with cellular. So do keep in mind of how you want to combine a future with something like Starlink or other satellite options that will give you, that global coverage with something like 5G cellular that will have actually much more potential peak speeds and local capacity, particularly in more congested urban and suburban areas. So combine the two and things get really interesting, and we've got a very exciting connectivity future ahead of us.
These videos are brought to you by our premium members, our mobile internet aficionados. They make it possible for us to track this news and create these videos. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, leave a comment, subscribe to our channel, or better yet, consider becoming a member yourself.